Most orchid owners would throw this plant away, and that's exactly why they never discover what happened next. For weeks, nothing changed. No roots, no growth, no recovery. Then something strange happened. The decline stopped. Not improvement, not growth, just silence. Yet that same pattern appeared again and again in orchids that later recovered. What if the very things people do to help their orchids are actually preventing recovery? Because hidden inside this plant was a forgotten survival mechanism. Almost nobody noticed it, until one day it activated. Then everything changed. The answer may completely change how you see recovery. By now, the orchid looked like a plant that had already lost the fight. Its leaves hung dull and wrinkled. The roots that once gripped the pot had collapsed into dry, hollow strands. The owner refused to give up. Fertilizer, root stimulants, careful watering schedules written on scraps of paper. Nothing changed. Weeks passed. Each morning began with hope and ended with disappointment. Yet the strange part was not that the orchid was dying. The strange part was that every attempt to save it seemed to make things worse. After each rescue effort, another root darkened, another leaf weakened. The harder the owner tried, the further recovery seemed to drift away. That contradiction slowly turned into a question. What if the problem was not neglect? What if something hidden was interfering with recovery itself? Most growers would never suspect it, because the recovery killer does not look dangerous. It often looks like help. More attention, more intervention, more urgency. We'll come back to that later. For now, one fact stood above everything else. This orchid was still alive. Somewhere inside those damaged leaves and exhausted roots, something had not surrendered yet. And the next clue would force growers to question one of the most trusted beliefs in orchid care. Days passed, then weeks. The orchid looked exactly the same. No new roots, no visible recovery, nothing. The owner kept reaching for the solutions most growers trust. Fertilizer. Another formula, root stimulants. Yet the orchid remained silent, or so it seemed. Then something strange happened. Not to this orchid, to another one. Both plants received similar care. Both were given the same kinds of help. Yet only one began producing healthy new roots. The other continued fading. And that raised an uncomfortable question. If fertilizer wasn't responsible, what was? Because the recovery was real. Months later, fresh roots emerged from a plant that should have kept declining. But none of the usual explanations seemed to fit. The timing didn't fit. The pattern didn't fit. The roots returned. The explanation didn't. The answer wasn't sitting on a fertilizer label. It wasn't hiding inside a bottle. Something else was influencing the outcome. Something hidden. Something easy to miss. And if the obvious answer was wrong, what were growers actually looking at? Because the next clue would challenge a belief so common that most orchid owners never think to question it. Imagine standing over an orchid you've spent months trying to save. Every morning begins the same way. You lift the pot. You search for a new root, a new leaf, any sign the plant is finally turning a corner, but nothing changes. Days pass, then weeks. No new roots, no stronger leaves, no sign that any of your effort is reaching the plant at all. This is the moment many growers know all too well. The moment frustration begins replacing hope, because if more care isn't helping, what else is left to do? The instinct is simple. Do more. More water. More nutrients, more rescue attempts. But sometimes that instinct creates a hidden danger. Because the harder some growers try to force recovery, the further recovery seems to move away. And without realizing it, they all make the same assumption, that the orchid's biggest problem is growth. But what if that's the trap? What if the orchid isn't asking for more growth at all? That possibility changes everything. Because it suggests many rescue attempts may be solving the wrong problem. And if that's true, how many orchids have been pushed harder when what they really needed was something entirely different? The deeper mystery isn't why some orchids fail. It's why some nearly dead orchids suddenly recover. And the next clue wouldn't appear as a new root. It would appear as something much easier to miss. Then one orchid changed everything. At first, it looked too ordinary to matter. No new roots, no sudden bloom, nothing that suggested recovery. Its leaves still hung soft. Its roots still looked exhausted. And that was exactly why nobody noticed the clue. A series of photographs taken over several weeks revealed it by accident. The decline had stopped. Not for a day, not for a week. It simply stopped getting worse. On camera, it looked like nothing. But when growers compared those images with orchids that never recovered, a strange pattern emerged. The same dividing line kept appearing. In recovering orchids, the timeline flattened. In failing orchids, it kept falling. This wasn't recovery yet, but it was the first break in the collapse, and that's the uncomfortable part. Because if this moment is mistaken for failure, an orchid can be discarded just before recovery begins. While everyone was watching for new roots, something else was happening first. Something quieter, something easier to miss. The clue wasn't growth. The clue appeared before growth. And that changed the question completely. Not when will new roots appear, but why did the decline stop at all? The first breakthrough didn't look like a breakthrough at all. There were still no new roots, no fresh leaves, no visible sign of recovery. But the camera caught something the eye almost missed. The collapse had stopped. Not recovery, not growth, just the absence of further decline. Only when the photos were placed side by side did the pattern become clear. The orchid wasn't improving, but it wasn't getting worse anymore. For the first time in months, the downward slide had paused. At first, it seemed insignificant. Then the same pattern appeared in another orchid, and another. Different plants. Same pause. Not every time, not immediately, but too often to ignore. Again and again, the pause came first. And if a grower mistook that pause for failure, the orchid might never reach what came next. That was the unsettling part. Because after that, we stopped looking only for roots. We started watching the silence. Recovery may begin before it becomes visible. The first sign wasn't a root, not a leaf, not a flower spike. It was the disappearance of decline. But there was a problem. This wasn't recovery. Not yet. Some orchids stayed frozen there. Others crossed over. Why? That question changed everything. Because what if the orchid wasn't deciding whether it could grow, but whether growth was worth the risk? And once you see it that way, a far more dangerous question appears. How long does the orchid have before that chance disappears? The pause didn't last forever, and that was the part nobody wanted to see. The same pattern appeared again and again. Week 1. The decline slowed. Week 3. The damage stopped spreading. Week 6. The plant held steady. Then the outcomes began to separate. Some orchids crossed into recovery. Others never did. And that's where the timeline stopped making sense. Because from the outside, both plants could look almost identical. Same leaves. Same époque. Same silence. Yet one was moving toward recovery. The other was running out of time. At first, the answer seemed simple. Maybe recovery was just a matter of waiting long enough. Then the comparisons destroyed that theory. Some orchids were given more time and still failed. Others recovered surprisingly fast. The clock mattered. But the clock wasn't the answer. Because most orchids are lost before growers realize they're running out of time. And the danger doesn't look dangerous. The leaves stop worsening. The roots stop collapsing. Everything appears stable. Yet this silent window may be the most important stage of all. A stage where the orchid moves closer to recovery, or further away from it, without showing obvious signs of either. Something was separating the orchids that crossed over from the ones that stayed behind. And that something would become the first real crack in everything growers believed about recovery. For years, most growers saw dying roots and reached the same conclusion. The roots were weak, the leaves were shrinking. The answer seemed obvious. Push growth. Feed more. Wake the plant up. But the timeline kept disagreeing. Again and again, the orchids that recovered followed a pattern that didn't fit that explanation. And eventually, an uncomfortable possibility emerged. Maybe these orchids were never trying to grow in the first place. The orchids that recovered weren't behaving like plants preparing for growth. They were behaving like plants trying not to die. That small difference changes the entire story. Suddenly, the earlier clues start lining up. The orchid wasn't failing to grow. It was refusing to take risks. And once that idea appears, the failed rescue attempts begin to look very different. The fertilizer may not have been useless. The root stimulant may not have failed. They may have been addressing the wrong problem, which means many growers may have spent months pushing for growth while the orchid was still trying to protect itself. The orchid isn't asking, "How do I grow?" It's asking something else. Is it safe enough to grow? For a moment, it feels like the mystery is solved. The orchid simply needs safety. Case closed. Except it wasn't, because some orchids still failed. Even after the decline stopped, even after the danger appeared to pass, And those were the cases that made the mystery impossible to ignore. Why would an orchid still hold back when the danger seemed gone? Imagine two orchids sitting side by side. Same pot, same light, same damaged roots. From the outside, they look identical. But inside, something very different may be happening. The hidden mistake we mentioned at the beginning? This was it. Not a toxic fertilizer, not a dangerous chemical, not one dramatic mistake that destroys an orchid overnight. The real damage came from something much smaller, harder to notice, and easier to repeat. Growers began watching two groups of orchids side by side. Same light, same temperature, same bark, same watering schedule. Yet one group began producing new roots. The other stayed frozen. Then a pattern emerged. The recovering orchids were mostly left alone. The struggling ones kept getting touched, moved, checked, and rescued. A root inspection, a pot adjustment, an early watering, another rescue attempt. Each action looked harmless. Each one felt like care. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because together, they created a pattern, repeated interruption. That was the recovery killer. Not one big mistake. Many small rescues repeated too often. The orchid finally reached a quiet window. Then the window was broken. Again, and again, and again. When the interruption stopped, more orchids crossed the line. But that was only half the story. Because even without repeated interruption, some orchids still held back. Removing the damage was not the same as triggering recovery. For years, growers kept looking in the same place. Roots need food. Roots need stimulation. Roots need hormones. So every rescue attempt pointed toward the same solution. More nutrients, more products, more intervention. But the orchids kept refusing that answer. Some were fed, some were treated, some were watched for weeks, yet nothing changed. What they lacked was harder to see. Imagine a town preparing for a storm. The streets empty. The doors close. Every resource is pulled inward, not because the town has stopped functioning, because survival comes first. A dying orchid does something remarkably similar. Long before new roots appear, it begins protecting what it still has. That was the missing clue. The orchid wasn't lacking energy. It was protecting it. And that's the turn most growers miss. A plant can still have energy and still refuse to spend it. For weeks, an orchid may sit in complete silence. No new roots, no visible progress. But quiet is not always empty. The energy is still there. The plant is simply not spending it yet. Then something changes. The pot stays still. The roots are left alone. The environment stops shifting. Little by little, the plant begins to spend again. The hidden recovery system starts to wake. Root development becomes possible. Not because resources suddenly increased, because survival no longer consumes them. That's the forgotten secret. Orchids don't regrow roots when they feel fed. They regrow roots when they stop sensing danger. But safety isn't recovery. Safety is permission. And that creates one final danger. What if the mechanism is still there, yet never gets triggered? Because an orchid can remain alive for months, while recovery never truly begins. New roots appear. Most growers finally breathe again. After weeks, sometimes months of waiting, recovery feels real. And that's where the trap begins. Because new roots are not proof that the struggle is over. They're proof that the struggle has entered its most fragile stage. A pale green root tip emerges. A tiny victory. The first visible sign that something hidden inside the plant has started moving again. And that's often when everything changes. The grower relaxes. Then comes the urge to help, to check, to adjust, to speed things up. But the danger isn't neglect. The danger is interference. Not because the roots are weak, because recovery is still unfinished. The plant has started rebuilding, but it hasn't become strong yet. It has only taken its first risk. And sometimes that risk is followed by another interruption, another adjustment, another attempt to help, and the recovery window begins to close again. That's the final trap, mistaking early recovery for permanent recovery. Recovery is real. It just isn't secure yet. The final danger isn't failure. It's disturbing recovery too soon. And for some orchids, that single mistake changes everything. Remember the orchid from the beginning? The one most people would have thrown away. The one with no roots, no growth, no visible future. This is that orchid. Now it looks almost unrecognizable. New roots, healthier leaves, Signs of life where decline once seemed inevitable. But that may not be the most surprising part. The biggest change was never the roots. It was learning how to read the silence before recovery. The orchid was never refusing help. It was waiting for conditions it could trust, waiting for danger to fade, waiting long enough to risk growing again. That's the part most growers never see. A struggling orchid doesn't always need more food. Sometimes it needs less danger. Sometimes the problem isn't that a living thing needs more help. It's that it needs fewer reasons to stay in survival mode. The orchid was never waiting for a miracle. It was waiting for safety. Only then did recovery become possible. And maybe the plant was never as finished as it looked. Maybe some orchids are lost not because they're dead, but because we stopped listening too soon. If your orchid still has living tissue, its story may be far from over. Maybe it's only waiting for the moment it can begin again.